The Delta game emulator has had one of the wildest journeys to the App Store of any app ever. Even after hitting #1 on the charts, the saga of this free indie app just keeps getting even more eventful. The most recent news from Delta is that Adobe forced it to change its logo because it looked too similar to Adobe's, but it's also kind of just like the Greek letter Delta, so okay, Adobe. This isn't even the first tech Goliath to take on Delta's two-person team. In fact, before Delta hit the App Store this spring, it was locked in a 10-year stalemate with Apple. The indie developers tried to find ways to sideload game emulators without jailbreaking their iPhones, but once they got around Apple's walled garden, Apple would fix the exploit they used to make it work. Let's back up. When Delta's creator, Riley Testa, was a high school senior, he wanted to play Pokemon on his phone. Who could blame him? But he didn't want to jailbreak his iPhone 4, so he loaded Pokemon Red onto a TI-84 calculator, but that wasn't scratching the itch, so he found an exploit that allowed anyone to download his Game Boy Advance emulator, GBA for iOS, onto their phones. Millions of downloads later, Apple patched this exploit, Testa went to college, and we didn't hear from him for a while. But suddenly, 10 years later, Apple changed its App Store policies to allow retro game emulators. Testa was shocked, but luckily he was still working in the app space. He's the founder of AltStore, which, as its name suggests, is an alternative app store. Why did Apple just change its stance on emulator apps so suddenly? Apple hasn't commented on this, but it could have something to do with increased regulatory pressure on Apple, since it was recently sued by the US Department of Justice over antitrust concerns. Meanwhile, AltStore only existed on Windows and Mac OS, but thanks to changing laws in the EU, AltStore, which hosts Delta, was able to come to the iOS in the EU. So, Testa thinks that even if the DOJ didn't sue Apple, the company still would have budged on its emulator policy. Testa told TechCrunch they just couldn't have the narrative that the coolest app on iPhone is only in Europe thanks to European regulators. Delta's issues with Adobe are a little less high stakes, but it still shows us that big tech companies are paying attention to the little guys. For now, Delta changed its logo to look like the letter Delta with its top chopped off and askew. While the app icon might look broken, the emulator itself very much is not. So if you have any ROM files for Game Boy Advanced games or Nintendo DS or any other retro game system, then get ready to set some screen time limits because you're going to be playing a lot of Delta.